In 1782, the British Parliament opted to halt ongoing warfare in North America, addressing the escalating rebellion there. After 7 grueling years of combat, depleted resources, and an overextended empire dealing with global challenges, the British chose to yield, allowing Americans to embrace their hard-earned independence. But what would the scenario have been had they chosen differently? What if the Americans faced defeat? Context of 1782. Evidently, 1782 wasn't Britain's finest hour. Engulfed in a plethora of global confrontations, the empire found itself overburdened. Their American campaign was faltering, they granted concessions to Ireland, and were simultaneously clashing with the French, Dutch, and Spanish in diverse arenas worldwide. To top it off, a hurricane demolished a fleet near Newfoundland. Given these adversities, their decision to withdraw from the American independence battle seems understandable. However, let's conjecture they deemed surrendering their expansive, established North American colonies too significant a setback. They choose to persist with the war, and in this alternate timeline, they emerge victorious. Exploring how the British might have turned the tables in the war. Ousting General Henry Clinton and General Charles Cornwallis could have been a strategic move. Their notorious disagreements, particularly after the extended campaign in South Carolina, were well known. Clinton's interpersonal challenges didn't just stop with Cornwallis, he had a knack for straining relations both above and below him. This abrasive nature significantly hampered Britain's chances of victory. Imagine if they were replaced by a duo that harmoniously strategized, merging the efforts of British forces in the north with a decisive southern offensive. The early end of Cornwallis' war, rooted in his entrapment at Yorktown under Clinton's directive, could have been avoided. Erase both Cornwallis and Clinton from the equation, and the Yorktown debacle is off the table. Despite their war weariness and the bolstered rebel forces thanks to French support, the British still maintained a notable advantage in terms of firepower. If Parliament had opted to persevere in the conflict, fresh British troops would have been deployed to North America. With the absence of the Yorktown entrapment, British forces would have had the liberty to wreak havoc across Virginia, targeting crucial supply routes bridging the North and South. Such maneuvers would inevitably have provoked a direct confrontation between Washington and the marauding British forces. The exposed rebel forces could then have been encircled by newly arrived British reinforcements from New York, effectively trapping them. The foundational British strategy was sound, only to be undermined by the poor leadership and interpersonal conflicts of key generals. With the rebel army captured and defeated, the British could have effectively quelled the uprising, steering history towards a different trajectory. Post-insurrection adjustments to pacify the once defiant population, certain adjustments would be essential. Prominent figures in the rebellion would likely lose their lands, which would be handed over to those who remained loyal. Ordinary fighters would receive clemency, and the onerous taxes that initially triggered the revolt would undergo revision. A more pronounced American representation would be established in the London Parliament, offering the much-desired voice for Americans. Without the American Revolution's success, it's likely the French Revolution would not have ensued. The American victory, supported by the French, sparked a revolutionary spirit in France. In this alternative history, rather than an expansive uprising, French citizens might advocate for incremental reforms, which the monarchy might cautiously accept. Absent the upheaval of revolutionary France, Napoleon's rise would be unlikely, eliminating the era of the Napoleonic Wars. With no Napoleonic figurehead and subsequent wars, Europe's landscape would have transformed significantly. The smaller conflicts and proxy battles prevalent in the 1780s would persist. An untamed borderland. The British showed minimal interest in venturing into North America's interiors during the 18th century. This untamed region acted as a protective barrier between the affluent coastal areas and the destabilizing elements lurking further west. The idea of moving westward was mainly an American ambition. However, without a victory in the war, the British wouldn't have welcomed settlers into the western lands as rapidly as the US did in our known history. Instead, discontented ex-rebels, felons, and runaway slaves would have sought refuge in the West, creating a chaotic frontier zone. The French would retain their stakes in Louisiana, but it remained sparsely populated. Without the presence of Napoleon or the US, the Louisiana Purchase wouldn't have occurred. The French would have clung to this uninhabited frontier, more as a symbolic presence in a continent they had otherwise lost influence over. To the west, Mexico would still achieve its independence from Spain in the early 19th century. Without the US as a neighboring force, Mexico would easily extend its reach into the Texas region and its adjoining territories, facing little to no resistance from European powers. A lack of American settlers implies no confrontations, leading to Mexico flourishing as a vast and resource-rich nation. In the Pacific Northwest, the British would still dominate the Oregon Country but would delineate a clear boundary with Mexico. Regarding the matter of slavery, the British Empire, even in this altered history, would have put an end to slavery in 1833. While there would undoubtedly be dissension and unrest in the southern sectors of North America, the comprehensive efforts to placate Southern loyalists after the unsuccessful rebellion would deter any militarized revolt. The plantation owners would likely receive financial compensations and additional support, mirroring the assistance provided to Caribbean plantation owners. As a result, by 1833, the chains of slavery would be broken in North America, circumventing the vast bloodshed witnessed during the U.S. Civil War in our own timeline. Come mid-19th century, this British Empire would mirror the one from our own records, with the addition of a robust, industrialized, and loyal domain on North America's eastern seaboard. American representation in the British Parliament would have been enhanced, establishing an image of a secondary Britain across the Atlantic. The bustling trade hubs of Boston, New York, Charleston, and Savannah would have significantly enriched the British, ensuring their unchallenged dominance and prosperity throughout the 19th century. A surge in population would also be inevitable. With millions of British nationals in North America during the period of the American Revolution, their allegiance would remain firm. This sizable and loyal demographic would enable the British to muster military reinforcements from the American territories, when necessary, in a manner akin to their recruitment from Australia and India during conflict periods. Venturing into the 20th century and beyond. As we drift further from our historical pivot, predicting potential outcomes becomes increasingly complex. One could speculate that a major conflict, akin to World War I, would have still ignited in Europe. Could American forces have been a decisive asset for the British Empire right at the war's inception, instead of anticipating a delayed ally to rally? Might the British have eventually granted independence to the American colonies, similar to how they did with other major colonies? In such a scenario, the United States might have paralleled the journeys of Canada and Australia, transforming into Commonwealth nations. The ascension of the United States to a global military superpower would probably have never occurred. That role would likely be retained by Britain. North America's landscape would predominantly be carved into British, Mexican, and French regions for a considerable span. Reflecting on it all, it's fascinating to muse about the potential twists in history. Especially given the proximity the British had to concluding the war favorably. If only the discord between General Clinton and General Cornwallis hadn't existed. If only Cornwallis had strategized more wisely than to deploy his entire army on a vulnerable peninsula. If only the British chose to infuse fresh battalions from Europe rather than persist with their weary ones.